They thought he was just another quiet kid in a hoodie, invisible in the chaos of a top-tier university lecture hall. But Eli Turner wasn't just another student. He was the kind of mind that didn't ask for attention. It commanded it when it mattered most. It was a brisk Tuesday morning in the University of Michigan's Advanced Mathematics Wing. The morning sun filtered through tall windows, painting golden lines across rows of tense students. Pages rustled. Pens tapped nervously. The air buzzed with last-minute calculations. At the center of the tension sat Professor Renee Caldwell, a name spoken with equal parts fear and admiration throughout campus. Her reputation was legendary, sharp, direct, and mercilessly brilliant. She didn't tolerate mediocrity. She didn't tolerate much at all. When she entered the hall, her heels clicked like a metronome of doom. Conversations died mid-sentence. "Last week we covered multivariable limits," she snapped, chalk in hand. "Today, Laplace transforms. Let's begin." With fluid motion, she filled the chalkboard with an intricate system of equations. Her handwriting was flawless, her rhythm practiced. Around the room, students scrambled to keep up. At the back, Eli Turner sat silently. Hood up, notebook untouched, at least until he spotted it. A flaw, tiny, hidden in complexity, but a mistake nonetheless. He hesitated. No one else noticed. Or if they did, they weren't brave or foolish enough to say anything. Then a hand rose from the front row. Professor Caldwell, I think there might be a mistake on the second line." The room froze. Caldwell turned slowly, expression flat. "There is no mistake." The girl sank into her seat, cheeks burning. Eli raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Turner?" Caldwell said, with a tone like a scalpel. "There's a misapplied coefficient," Eli said evenly. "It shifts the final result." The class went still. Professor Caldwell's jaw clenched. "Then by all means, correct it." Eli rose, calm and methodical. He approached the board, erased a line, and reworked the equation. His voice was low but clear as he explained, "You carried the coefficient too early in the transform. This preserves the function's structure." The room watched in stunned silence. Caldwell's smile was thin. "Fine, you corrected it. Congratulations, no warmth, just acknowledgement." Eli returned to his seat, unmoved by the buzz around him. But something in the room had shifted. Power, even intellectual power, had subtly changed hands. Professor Caldwell sensed it, which is why she didn't move on. "If Mr. Turner is so confident," she said, already turning back to the board, "perhaps he'd like to try something more challenging." She scrawled a monstrous equation, a brutal cocktail of multivariable integrals and nonlinear twists. It stretched the full length of the board. Heads turned, eyes widened. She tapped the final symbol. "This should be a fair challenge." Eli stared up at the sprawling equation. A challenge, yes, but also a message. She was trying to put him back in his place. He knew it. Everyone did, but he stood anyway. A few students chuckled quietly. Caldwell's impossible problems were infamous across campus. Even some of the best students whispered they were designed not to be solved, just to humble. Eli stepped up to the board. No bravado, no theatrics, just quiet precision. He lifted the chalk and began. His strokes were clean, deliberate. Each line flowed naturally into the next, the chaos of the equation slowly transforming into something beautiful. Structured, elegant, clear. The room shifted from amusement to awe. Eyes narrowed. Pens stopped. People leaned in, breath held. Halfway through he paused, then turned his head toward Professor Caldwell. "Would you like the solution expressed in exponential terms or using sine and cosine?" A murmur rippled through the room. Caldwell's face tightened. She nodded, once. Eli kept going. His voice was calm, his logic seamless. He boxed the answer, set the chalk down, and returned to his seat without looking back. For a long beat, no one spoke. Then Caldwell approached the board. She stared at the solution, line by line, searching for any excuse to tear it apart. She found none. "You skipped a step," she said, her voice clipped. Eli looked up. "I did the partial fraction decomposition mentally. I can write it out if you'd like." He wasn't smug, he wasn't even defensive, just factual. Caldwell paused, then said, "No, that won't be necessary." The silence that followed was dense. Students whispered. Some grinned, others just stared. A few exchanged glances that said, "Did that really just happen?" But it wasn't over. The next class session came with a tension so thick you could cut it with a protractor. Students entered the hall in hushed clusters, eyes darting toward Eli, who sat, as he always did, hood up, notebook open, pencil tapping. He didn't lean into the attention. He didn't acknowledge it at all. Professor Caldwell entered a few minutes later, a manila folder under one arm and a coffee in the other. She scanned the room until her gaze locked on him. "We have an announcement," she said, tone cold and precise. "The university has been invited to participate in this year's Collegiate Mathematics Symposium." The room buzzed. Eyes widened. The symposium was no joke. An elite competition for the top mathematical minds in the region. It was where legends were made or broken. "I've submitted the name of our top candidate." Her eyes didn't leave Eli. "Mr. Turner, I assume you're up for it." The challenge wasn't in the words. It was in the way she said them. Calculated, loaded, a public test. Eli met her gaze, calm. "I'm in." A tight-lipped smile curled on her face. "Excellent. Let's hope last week wasn't just a lucky spark." After class, Jay caught up with Eli outside the library, a protein bar in one hand, concern in his eyes. "Dude," he said, dropping into the seat beside him, "that wasn't an invite. That was a trap." Eli nodded. "I know." "She's pissed. You embarrassed her. This," Jay gestured around, "is her way of taking control back." Eli shrugged. "Which means I have to win." Jay let out a low whistle. "Of course you do." The next 4 weeks blurred into one long equation. Eli practically moved into a corner of the library. His table became a battlefield. Whiteboards covered in symbols, sticky notes tacked in color-coded layers, scrap paper stacked like snowdrifts. Highlighters bled into the margins of dense textbooks. Sleep became optional. Focus was mandatory. This wasn't just practice, it was preparation for war. Every night, Professor Caldwell's voice echoed in his head. Not the words, but the tone. Cold, sharp, calculated. She didn't trap him with math. She did it with spectacle, ego, pressure. She wanted to see if he'd fold. He wouldn't. And people began to notice. First, it was just Jay, dropping by with snacks, tossing new problems his way. Then, a few classmates showed up. Then more. By the second week, a small crowd gathered during breaks, watching Eli work in real time. They tried to stump him. They failed. Jay called it Underground Math Club. Eli called it Focus. He didn't gloat, he didn't show off. He solved, rewrote, refined. The night before the competition, Eli sat alone in the farthest wing of the library, staring through the tall windows at the snowy quad. Campus lights flickered. Snow dusted the bell tower. He didn't feel ready, not because he doubted his ability, but because he understood the stakes. This wasn't about one exam. It wasn't even about Professor Caldwell anymore. It was about every student who had ever been belittled, dismissed, underestimated, especially by people like her. This was no longer just math, it was narrative, it was power. At dawn, Eli boarded a shuttle headed east. The symposium was being held at the University of Pennsylvania's elite math department, a glass and steel temple to intellect, the kind of place where even the walls looked like they calculated derivatives. He walked in wearing the same hoodie, same jeans, same quiet. He didn't need a speech. He brought a beat-up notebook and fire in his chest. The auditorium buzzed with nervous energy. Dozens of students, professors, and judges filled the rows. Most of the competitors were older. Some were already in graduate school. One sat directly across from Eli. Brandon Lynn, a PhD candidate from Caltech, whispered to have never lost a math competition. Lynn barely glanced at Eli. That changed when the results from the first round were posted. Eli Turner, number 1, mental math, theoretical application, speed solving. Eli didn't just survive, he soared. Each round, his logic was surgical, his movement swift, precise. While others celebrated after solving, Eli stayed still, pencil down, eyes steady. But someone was watching him closely. Professor Caldwell, 3rd row, perfect posture. Her knuckles white around the program in her lap. She had lit a fire, expecting him to burn. Instead, she watched him forge something unstoppable. The final round of the Collegiate Mathematics Symposium wasn't designed to be solved. It was designed to break you. The problem flashed onto the auditorium screen, a towering hybrid of layered integrals, matrix transformations, and abstract variable, stitched together in a way that looked more like chaos than logic. It was the kind of equation that even seasoned professors would need a whiteboard and a weekend to untangle. Above the stage, the silent countdown began. 45 minutes. Eli didn't flinch. To his right, Brandon Lynn was already scribbling, moving fast, aggressive, determined, confident. Around the room, other finalists took off at different paces. Some whispered steps under their breath, some sat frozen, paralyzed. Eli just watched. Still. Silent. He wasn't looking for the answer, he was listening for the rhythm. Every great problem had one. Buried in the noise was structure, harmony, a path. And when he saw it, he began. His pencil moved like a violinist's bow, smooth, unhurried, deliberate. Every symbol had a reason, every step was intentional. His left hand held the notebook steady, his right carved a narrative from the mess. In the 3rd row, Professor Caldwell sat stone still. She hadn't moved once. Her face betrayed nothing. But her eyes? Her eyes tracked every stroke Eli made. She wasn't clapping. She wasn't smiling. She was watching the walls of control she built begin to shift. 20 minutes in, Eli paused. Not because he was stuck, but because he saw it. A pattern, a shortcut. Buried in the chaos was a symmetry, an elegant trick that bypassed the brute force path every other student was hacking through. He glanced left. Brandon Lynn was knee-deep in side calculations, brow furrowed. Eli adjusted, pivoted, accelerated. By minute 35, the murmurs in the audience started. Professors leaned forward. Judges exchanged glances. The tracking monitor, measuring progress silently, showed Eli nearing completion. The others were still midway. In the 3rd row, Caldwell's leg began to bounce. Barely noticeable, but there. She had pushed him into this competition to make a point, and now she was watching him make history. At minute 39, Eli wrote his final line, boxed it, set down his pencil. Only then did he look up and met her eyes. Professor Caldwell didn't look away. The final 6 minutes ticked by like a drumbeat. Brandon scribbled to the very end, jaw tight, hands tense. He submitted just before the clock hit 0, then silence. The head judge, a quiet mathematician from Yale, stepped on stage holding 2 sets of papers. He studied both, compared them to the master solution, flipped through pages with mechanical precision. The room was so still you could hear the snow fall outside. Finally, the judge stepped to the microphone. After careful review, we have our winner. Representing the University of Michigan, Eli Turner. The room erupted. Cheers, whistles, gasps. Jay jumped up in the middle rows, nearly knocking over a chair as he fist-pumped. Eli didn't react. Not yet. He just breathed, slowly, deliberately, and walked to the stage. No swagger, no showmanship, just calm. He accepted the engraved trophy with a small nod. Cameras flashed. Professors offered polite congratulations. Brandon Lynn shook his hand. No bitterness, only respect. In the 3rd row, Caldwell clapped once, twice, then stopped. Their eyes met one more time, and this time her expression had changed. No condescension, no test, no challenge. Just a quiet nod of acknowledgement. The morning after the symposium, campus felt different. The usually quiet math corridors buzzed with low conversations. Students who had never spoken to Eli Turner now nodded at him in passing. His name echoed in hushed tones, a mixture of curiosity, respect, and disbelief. His win had traveled faster than the snowfall, through group chats, university forums, even a spotlight article on the school's homepage. Freshman Prodigy defeats PhD at regional symposium. But Eli didn't chase the attention. He walked the same way he always had, hoodie up, headphones in, notebook under one arm, letting the noise swirl around him without letting it in. When he stepped into Professor Caldwell's lecture hall, the air changed. Heads turned. Some students offered him seats that used to be reserved for Caldwell's favorites. Jay was already there, feet up, grinning like a proud brother. "I heard they're calling you the Michigan Mind," he whispered. Eli shook his head and slid into his usual seat. "That's ridiculous. You did destroy a PhD in front of half the country," Jay said. "Let him talk." Professor Caldwell entered exactly on time. She walked to the podium, set down her briefcase, and scanned the room. Her gaze lingered on Eli for a moment. Then she spoke. "Before we begin," she said, voice even but laced with weight, "I'd like to take a moment to recognize Eli Turner." A pause. She continued. "Yesterday, Eli represented our university at the Collegiate Mathematics Symposium. Not only did he perform exceptionally, he placed first against some of the most advanced minds in the nation." There was applause, some loud, some respectful. Jay let out a celebratory whoop that made a few students chuckle. Caldwell allowed the sound to settle. "It's not easy to rise to a challenge," she added, "especially one you didn't ask for. Eli did, and he succeeded." Her eyes met his again. For the first time, no walls, no games, no power plays, just honesty. "If anyone here still believes brilliance only comes in a certain package, think again." Then she turned to the board and began her lecture. But it wasn't her classroom anymore, not entirely. A new gravity had entered the room, and it centered around Eli. That evening, Eli sat at his usual corner table in the campus library. The notebook in front of him was filled with half-finished equations. The symposium trophy sat tucked in his bag, untouched. Not because it meant nothing, but because what really mattered couldn't be engraved into metal. As he traced the lines of a new problem, one he wasn't assigned, one he wasn't required to solve, the door creaked. Footsteps approached. He looked up. Professor Caldwell. She stood beside his table, holding a white envelope. "May I?" she asked. He nodded, curious but composed. She sat across from him and handed him the envelope. "The department is nominating you for the National Undergraduate Fellowship," she said. It's early, but after what you did, the committee agreed unanimously. Eli blinked. I didn't even know I was being considered. You weren't, she said with a faint smile. Until you made us see you. There was no bitterness, just admiration, quiet and sincere. As she stood to leave, she paused. You didn't just solve a problem, Eli, you rewrote the narrative. She walked away, heels echoing softly. Eli opened the envelope. Inside was the official nomination letter. But beneath the polished language, it was something else entirely. A signal. That maybe, just maybe, the world was starting to recognize brilliance in places it had too long overlooked. He leaned back, letting the weight of the moment settle. Not heavy, but full. Full of pride, of possibility, of the quiet certainty that he hadn't just passed a test. He had changed the game, and he was just getting started,